Crime and Punishment, written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Part 1. Chapter 1. A young, impoverished former student, Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, leaves his very small apartment in St. Petersburg, Russia, and walks outside. It is July and very hot. He does not wish to see his landlord, to whom he owes months of unpaid rent, but he no longer fears her. He simply does not wish to be bothered by her questions. He has stopped caring for his appearances and goes around in rags, often talking to himself on the street. He acknowledges aloud that he has a fantasy he is contemplating putting into action. Near the Haymarket, a poor neighborhood and gathering place for prostitutes, a drunk man yells at Raskolnikov about his hat, which is so broken and dented as to be noticeable. Raskolnikov remarks to himself that small details like the hat could cause his whole plan to fail. Raskolnikov knows exactly how many steps, 730, it takes to get to a particular house, the destination for the day's trial. Raskolnikov enters the apartment house, where many lower-middle-class people live, and walks to the 4th floor. There, a German official is moving out, meaning the old woman, whom Raskolnikov is going to see, will soon be the sole tenant on her floor. Raskolnikov rings and is questioned by the old woman, who opens the door slightly but, seeing others moving out of the German's apartment, is reassured of her safety. She lets him inside. Raskolnikov introduces himself, and the old woman replies that she remembers his visit the previous month. They walk further into the apartment, and Raskolnikov observes the spare, clean furnishings, which he believes are maintained by a woman named Lizaveta. Raskolnikov announces he has something to pawn with the old woman, whose name is Alyona Ivanovna. She is a pawnbroker, thus explaining Raskolnikov's previous visit, when he pawned a ring for 2 rubles. Now he offers his father's watch, which Alyona believes is worth 1.5 rubles, minus interest accrued on the ring. Raskolnikov is angered, but accepts her low offer. Before he leaves, Raskolnikov says he will have something else to pawn soon, a cigarette case. He also asks whether Lizaveta, Alyona's sister, lives with her and is around often. Alyona brushes the question off distrustfully. Overcome by anguish and horror at his plans, Raskolnikov leaves the apartment. He decides to enter a tavern, which he never does, and drink to ease his hunger. He gulps down a beer and feels much better. Looking around the tavern, he spots 2 drinkers and 1 other man, a retired official, sitting quietly and separately. Chapter 2. Raskolnikov finds that he now wishes to be in the company of others. For the past month, he has spurned all company. He glances at the retired official, who appears ready to talk to him. The man has a face swollen from drink and is ill-shaved and dirty. He begins speaking to Raskolnikov, introducing himself as Marmeladov, a low-ranking civil servant. Raskolnikov begins explaining that he is a student, only to break off and experience an irritable feeling of loathing. Marmeladov speaks eagerly. He says that poverty is not a vice, but total poverty, destitution, is indeed one. He also admits to having slept on the banks of the Neva the past 5 nights. The tavern's owner and a worker laugh at Marmeladov, egging him on with questions about his life. Marmeladov begins a long, confused discussion of his problems. His wife, Katerina Ivanovna, was recently beaten by a man named Lebeziatnikov, whom Marmeladov had asked, in vain, for a loan. Marmeladov tells Raskolnikov that Katerina is of higher birth, the daughter of an officer, and describes himself as but a brute. Katerina is suffering from consumption, tuberculosis, but Marmeladov has spent all the family's money on drink. Marmeladov explains his problems more specifically, feeling that Raskolnikov is a sorrowful man and therefore might understand. Katerina was educated in a school for nobles and received a certificate of merit for her studies. This inherent nobility, according to Marmeladov, explains why she would not tolerate Lebeziatnikov's rudeness, which Marmeladov does not describe further. Her recent comments to Lebeziatnikov caused him to beat her. Marmeladov goes on. He met Katerina when she was widowed with 3 children. Her first husband, an officer, had gambling debts and died during a court proceeding. Marmeladov was also a widower with a 14-year-old daughter. He married Katerina and swore off drinking for 1 year. But Marmeladov later lost his job and began drinking again. Over the next year and a half, he found work intermittently and continued drinking, only to arrive in Petersburg, find a job, and lose it once more. He, Katerina, and the 3 young children live at Fyodorovna Lipwexel's house. Marmeladov then speaks of his daughter from his first marriage, Sonia, whom he tried to educate in her youth, before the family ran out of money. Earlier, Katerina complained that Sonia, old enough to work, was not contributing to the family's welfare. Marmeladov tells of one night, when Sonia finally went out to work and returned after 8, presumably having prostituted herself for 30 rubles, which she gave to Katerina. Katerina accepted the money and kissed Sonia's feet as Sonia wept in bed. Sonia is forced to carry a yellow pass, indicating she is a prostitute. Marmeladov then reveals the source of the quarrel between Katerina and Lebeziatnikov. At first, Lebeziatnikov attempted to solicit Sonia, but he thought better of it and reported that it would not be honorable to live in the same house as a prostitute. Katerina took issue with this comment and spoke to Lebeziatnikov, who beat her. Sonia was therefore kicked out of the building. She now lives with a tailor Kapernalmov and his family, who are all tongue-tied, sufferers of speech impediments. Marmeladov went to his supervisor after Sonia's dismissal and begged for one more chance at his job, which he was granted. Marmeladov's new job changed the family dynamic entirely. Katerina, who formerly only loathed her husband, began cooking him more elaborate meals and mending his clothes. Sonia even visited him, but at night only, so as not to arouse suspicion. Katerina even became friendly again with the landlady, Amalia Fyodorovna, and told her, falsely, of Marmeladov's important position at the office. 6 days previous to his conversation with Raskolnikov, Marmeladov brought home his first salary, and his family situation seemed secure. But Marmeladov's alcoholism proved too much. He stole his salary from Katerina's trunk and, for the past 5 days, has been inebriated and sleeping outside. He even asked Sonia for a little extra money for a final bottle, which she gave him. Marmeladov drinks the last of that bottle before Raskolnikov and goes on a long rant, claiming that, though he does not deserve pity, he will nonetheless be forgiven by God, as will Sonia. He will be welcomed into heaven along with other sinners and fools. After Marmeladov's speech, Raskolnikov agrees to accompany him home. Marmeladov's family lives in a subdivided corner of Amalia Lipwexel's 4th-floor apartment, and their living space is cramped and filled with garbage and rags. Katerina, who is rather young but haggard and sickly in appearance, notices Raskolnikov and Marmeladov in the doorway and begins screaming at her husband, asking if he really took all the money and dragging him by the hair into the main room. Marmeladov, being dragged, claims that his punishment is a delight to him. Frau Lipwexel arrives, announcing the family must leave the apartment immediately. Raskolnikov leaves unnoticed and places a handful of money from his own pocket on a windowsill. On his way out, he regrets giving this money away but realizes he cannot take it back. He also comments to himself that man will become accustomed to even the lowliest of circumstances. Chapter 3. Raskolnikov awakes unhappy the next morning in his cramped, dusty, sparely furnished apartment. The building's maid Nastasia arrives and orders Raskolnikov to rise from bed, since it's past 9 o'clock. He gives her some small change for food, drinks her stale tea, and is convinced to eat a small portion of cabbage soup. Nastasia informs Raskolnikov that his landlady, Praskovia Pavlovna, is initiating a police complaint against him for payment of back rent. Nastasia chastises Raskolnikov for his laziness. He no longer teaches children and claims his only work is thinking. Before leaving, Nastasia gives Raskolnikov a letter from his mother, sent from the provinces. Raskolnikov reads the letter. His mother Pulcheria has not written for 2 months, but can now tell Raskolnikov of recent good fortune in their family. Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister, has been working as a servant in the house of the Svidrigalovs, relatively wealthy family in the Samar province. Dunya took out a salary advance of 100 rubles when she began work in order to send 60 to Raskolnikov the previous year, and his mother has also sent smaller portions of her own pension, inherited from Raskolnikov's father after his death. Dunya's position was placed in jeopardy when Mr. Svidrigailov began making passes at her, eventually asking her to elope with him. Dunya refused but, hoping not to lose her job, stayed in her position for 6 weeks, during which time Marfa Svidrigailov overheard her husband begging Dunya once again to run away with him. Marfa mistook Dunya for the initiator of affections and dismissed her immediately, much to Raskolnikov family's shame. Pulcheria and Dunya were afraid to inform Raskolnikov of this news, not wanting to burden him, and did not write during the intervening 2 months. Marfa slandered Dunya throughout the province, further shaming the family. But Svidrigailov ultimately could not stand the lies being told, however unknowingly, by his wife. He confessed to her and proved his guilt by providing a letter of Dunya's in which she refused Svidrigailov and chastised him for his immorality. Now Marfa experienced a great shame and went to the houses of the province revoking her previous statements and insisting on Dunya's total innocence. Dunya's reputation was restored, and in short order a relative of Marfa's named Pyotr Petrovich Luzin proposed marriage to her. Dunya and Pulcheria have agreed in principle to this marriage, arranged speedily, without Raskolnikov's consent, as Pulcheria goes on to explain. Luzin met with Dunya once, in a formal setting, before proposing. He is 45 years old, a rising government official, and still handsome, in Pulcheria's words. He is also in accord with the political fashions of the time, meaning he is politically liberal, and describes himself as an enemy of all prejudice. Pulcheria admits that Dunya does not feel a special love for Luzin, but her inherent goodness and his solid circumstances should make for a strong match. In the letter, Pulcheria describes how, at his second visit with the family, Luzin announces that it is ideal for a husband to marry an impoverished woman who has experienced some hardship, since then she will see her husband as her protector. This comment dismays Pulcheria, but Dunya distinguishes between Luzin's words and his possible behavior as a future husband. She decides to accept Luzin's marriage proposal. Meanwhile, Luzin is en route to Petersburg, where he must attend a matter in the Senate. Both Pulcheria and Dunya hope that Luzin will take on Raskolnikov as a secretary, with a secret wish that he become partner one day. Luzin says that he does need a secretary, and having a family member in the position would be convenient. Luzin wishes to meet Raskolnikov in Petersburg. Dunya has already spoken highly of her brother to her fiancé, but he resolves that he will judge Raskolnikov's character in person. Pulcheria reveals that Luzin will send for her and for Dunya within a week, bringing them to Petersburg. Luzin will pay for, only, some of their travel's costs, but news of the marriage will enable Pulcheria to receive an advance on her pension from her creditor, meaning she can send Raskolnikov 25 or 30 rubles very soon. Dunya has joked to Pulcheria that she is so excited to see Raskolnikov, she would marry Luzin almost for that reason alone. Pulcheria closes her letter with an outpouring of love and great happiness at the family's reunion after 3 years' separation. Raskolnikov is greatly agitated by the letter and must leave his apartment when he finishes reading. Chapter 4. Outside, Raskolnikov walks and talks to himself. He decides he will not permit Luzin to marry Dunya under any circumstances. He also dismisses his mother's justifications for the speed of the courtship and for Luzin's behavior, believing that Pulcheria has misrepresented the family's happiness and Dunya's willingness to go through with the marriage. Raskolnikov believes, in fact, that Pulcheria has sacrificed Dunya's happiness in order to secure the family financially and provide for Raskolnikov, her firstborn. Raskolnikov thinks that, if Luzin were present, he might attempt to kill him. Raskolnikov goes on to denounce Luzin for his penny-pinching behavior. Since Pulcheria and Dunya will have to pay for much of their travel, Luzin will cover the cost of luggage, which is often free. Raskolnikov believes that, although Pulcheria has insisted she will not live with the couple after their marriage, Luzin will be too noble to allow Pulcheria to live separately. Raskolnikov places less faith in Luzin's generosity and curses his mother's naivete in the face of Luzin's cheapness and self-interest. Raskolnikov turns his thoughts to Dunya, whose character he believes to be pure and noble. Dunya would never marry a man only for money, he avers. She is marrying Luzin in order to secure Raskolnikov's future. He believes that, if Dunya were to marry for his sake, she would be no better than the prostitute Sonia. Raskolnikov becomes more and more upset and declares, finally, that he will not accept Dunya's sacrifice, and he will keep the marriage from going forward. Raskolnikov weighs his options. He could repay Dunya and Pulcheria once he has established himself in a solid professional position, but that could take 10 years, and Pulcheria might well be old and sick by then. His other option is to accept fate and renounce any right to act, to live, to love. His plan of yesterday regarding the pawnbroker hits him in the head, seeming realer and more necessary than ever, and he nearly passes out at the thought of it. To recover, he finds a nearby bench. On his way to the bench, Raskolnikov notices a young woman, no older than 16, swaying to and fro in casual clothes. She is profoundly drunk at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Raskolnikov wishes to help the girl and notices a 30-year-old man, well-dressed, following the girl with certain intentions. Raskolnikov insults the man and gets into a fight with him, only to be pulled away by a policeman, to whom he explains the girl's predicament and the man's predatory nature. The man has meanwhile moved away, pretending innocently to smoke a cigarette. Raskolnikov gives the police officer 20 kopecks, the last of his money, and tells him to arrange transportation for the girl. The policeman agrees to protect her and follows her as she stumbles and refuses help. The dandy continues on the other side of the street, also following the girl. Suddenly Raskolnikov becomes disgusted and yells to the policeman to leave off. They should all just have fun, he says, and it's no one else's business. The policeman, confused by Raskolnikov's outburst, continues after the girl. Raskolnikov realizes the policeman kept his money and wonders if Dunya will suffer a fate similar to the girl's. Raskolnikov remembers that, after reading the letter, he intended to head to the home of his friend Razumikin, a cheerful and socially adept student who was Raskolnikov's only companion at the university. Razumikin also lives in crushing poverty but appears more capable than Raskolnikov of bearing his difficult circumstances. He does so while remaining mostly happy. Razumikin has also been forced to withdraw temporarily from school for lack of tuition. He and Raskolnikov have not seen each other recently. Raskolnikov has been avoiding him. Chapter 5. Raskolnikov does not know why exactly he wishes to see his friend. He does not really want any of Razumikin's teaching lessons, nor does he want advice about Dunya's situation. But he also does not wish to return to his cramped apartment. He decides simply to walk where his feet take him. He walks through a nicer part of town, eats pie and drinks a glass of vodka, and overcome by sleepiness he collapses in the bushes. Raskolnikov has a vivid dream, which the narrator attributes to his morbid condition. In the dream he is about 7 and walking with his father on a holiday. He passes a tavern en route to a cemetery to pay respect to his deceased grandmother and younger brother, who died when Raskolnikov himself was quite young. Near the tavern, a group of drunk peasants are standing around a small, old horse fixed to an enormous, heavy cart. One of the peasants shouts that he will take all assembled in the cart, although no one believes it is possible. The peasants get into the cart. The man says he will make the horse gallop, though she is old and probably hasn't galloped for years. The peasants begin whipping the horse, which can only manage a very slow walk under the cart's strain. The man says he will whip the horse to death, and when whipping is no longer sufficient, he takes a large shaft from the cart and beats her on the back. One peasant cries that they ought to use an axe, but the man continues with the shaft until the horse is dead. He justifies the killing by saying the horse is his own property. Young Raskolnikov rushes toward the peasant and tries to fight him. His father has to pull him away. Raskolnikov awakes in the bushes in a fever and sweat. For the first time he wonders aloud whether he really can hit the pawnbroker with an axe, kill her, and take her money. Although he made a trial run yesterday, the dream leads Raskolnikov to believe that he would not be able to carry out the murder in reality. He decides to return home but takes a longer route through the Haymarket. It is nighttime. Raskolnikov enjoys walking through the Haymarket because his rags and poor appearance do not attract people's attention here, amidst other signs of poverty. Suddenly, as if ordained by a kind of fate, he thinks later, he sees Lizaveta speaking to a man and woman on a corner. The man and woman insist that Lizaveta disregard her sister's orders. Whatever they may be, Raskolnikov hears only the middle of the conversation, and come back to the Haymarket the next day between 6 and 7. Raskolnikov recognizes that this means the old woman will be alone for 1 hour tomorrow. Now the freedom and aversion to murder he experienced after his dream disappear. He feels fate has ordained this set of circumstances. He must carry out his original murderous plan. Even if he had tried to learn the old woman's schedule, he would never have known with such exactness when to find her alone. The chance encounter in the Haymarket must, then, have been fated. Chapter 6. Raskolnikov later learns that Lizaveta works as a middleman between families who must sell off their clothing and merchants. She then resell these clothes to the public. Raskolnikov recalls his first meeting with Alyona the pawnbroker, recommended by a fellow student in case Raskolnikov ever needed extra cash. After pawning his ring, given him by his sister as a keepsake, Raskolnikov entered a tavern and overheard a student and a young officer discussing the very same pawnbroker, describing her great wealth, her unscrupulous business practices, and her cruel treatment of Lizaveta, whom she beats. The student and officer went on to discuss Lizaveta, who is younger, timid, humble, and entirely at the beck and call of Alyona. The student tells his friend that he would kill the old woman without remorse. He goes on to justify this hypothetical action by saying that the old woman causes great suffering, since hundreds of people depend on her for pawning and small loans, and her death would actually improve those people's condition. But the student says he himself wouldn't do the killing. Raskolnikov remembers being shocked at this conversation, because he was thinking along exactly the same lines. He later attributes this overheard conversation to fate. After leaving the Haymarket, he returns to his room and sleeps heavily the entire night. He is awoken by Nastasia, who brings him tea and soup, and he daydreams of a caravan making its way across Egypt. He realizes that it is nearly dinner time, and that he must put his plan into action. As he planned 2 weeks ago, he tears a strip of old clothing and sews it into his coat as a loop for the axe head. Raskolnikov also finds the piece of wood lined with iron, wrapped, which he will give to the pawnbroker as a fake pledge, or object to be pawned, to distract her during the act. He overhears someone in the courtyard announce it is long past 6. Raskolnikov must now steal an axe. He remarks how sure his plans once seemed, and now how unresolved and problematic they are. He had planned to borrow the axe out of the house's kitchen when Nastasia was out. He feels that he is being dragged into the crime as into the cogs of a machine, and he believes that, while committing a crime, a disease clouds man's judgment and makes the man more likely to be caught. Raskolnikov vows to avoid these pitfalls if he can. Despite these rational justifications, however, Raskolnikov feels his plan is slipping away from him, even as he resolves more than ever to carry it out. But as he goes downstairs, he sees that Nastasia is home, making it impossible to steal the axe. As he passes by, cursing himself, he looks into the caretaker's closet and sees an axe under a bench. He is encouraged by this coincidence and slips the axe into the coat's loop. He realizes, however, that he has not changed out of his noticeable hat. As he walks, he daydreams about improvements to be made to a park in Petersburg. Raskolnikov climbs the old woman's staircase unnoticed, past the second floor where there are painters working. No one else is present. Raskolnikov stands outside the old woman's door and worries that he is too pale. He fears he will arouse her suspicions, but rings the bell anyway. He senses the old woman on the other side of the door and moves back, to make it seem he is calm and not hiding from her. She begins to lift the latch. Chapter 7. Raskolnikov becomes flustered and, hearing the door open, pulls it outward, and the old woman along with it. He scares her, and she does not initially recognize him. He introduces himself again, and says he has brought along the new pledge he promised. He presents the cigarette case, which she accepts and moves inside to unwrap. Raskolnikov recognizes his chance has come. He hits her, almost mechanically, with the blunt end of the axe, and she cries only slightly. He hits her again and again until she is dead. He feels in possession of his reason, and reaches carefully into her pocket to remove her keys, which he uses to try to open the chest of drawers in the woman's bedroom. But the keys frustrate him, and he returns to the woman's body, from which he removes a purse tied around her neck. He stuffs the purse into his pocket without looking at it. After fumbling more with the drawers, He looks under the woman's bed and finds a trunk. In the trunk are old clothes, and Raskolnikov begins wiping his hands on the red silk, because red will hide the color of blood. Valuables fall out of the clothes, and Raskolnikov stuffs them indiscriminately into his pockets. He hears the sound of footsteps in the other room and stops, terrified. Lizaveta has arrived and seen her slain sister. Raskolnikov enters, and Lizaveta feebly places her left hand in the air, as if to ward him off. Without hesitation, Raskolnikov hits Lizaveta in the head with the blunt end of the axe and splits her skull, killing her. He finds a bucket of water and washes all the blood from the axe, slipping it back into his coat. He inspects his clothes for blood and realizes he must escape. He looks up and realizes, to his horror, that the door was wide open the whole time. He then hears footsteps mounting the stairs. He manages to shut and lock the door in time. He on the inside, two men on the outside. One large man, named Coke, rings the bell several times and yells rudely for the old woman and Lizaveta. A young man also arrives, having hoped to pawn something with the woman. They discuss what to do, wondering if the woman has gone out, and the young man realizes the door's hook is rattling, meaning it is locked from inside and someone is home. The young man, who is studying to be a public investigator, tells Coke to stay upstairs, since he suspects foul play, while he runs to get the caretaker. Raskolnikov stands behind the door holding his axe, but Coke becomes impatient with the young man and follows him. Raskolnikov takes this opportunity to open the door and slip outside. As he is going downstairs, the two painters on the second floor coincidentally get into an argument and run out, leaving the apartment they are painting empty. Raskolnikov ducks inside and hides behind a wall while Coke and the young man mount the stairs to the old woman's apartment. He then exits the building, debating what to do and how to elude the two men, who at that moment are discovering the corpses. He returns, nearly unconsciously, to his house, places the axe back in the caretaker's empty room, and lies down in his closet, with only bits and scraps of various thoughts in his head. Part 2. Chapter 1. Raskolnikov awakes slowly, realizing it is 2 in the morning, and then he remembers what he has done. He races around his closet, checking for evidence from the crime. He finds blood on the cuff of his trouser and cuts it off. Then he takes all the material he stole from the old woman and places it in a hutch in the corner, behind a flap of wallpaper. He thinks better of this hiding place but has no other option, then scours the apartment again for evidence, finding blood in a trouser pocket and on his sock. He removes these blood-soaked bits of cloth, but, finding no place to put them, falls asleep once again. He is awoken by Nastasia's knock. She and the caretaker enter. The caretaker tells him he has been summoned to the police station. Nastasia notices the rags in his hands and thinks they are simply something he sleeps with, for comfort. The two leave and Raskolnikov prepares to go to the station, wondering why he has been summoned and willing, out of cynicism of perdition, to leave his apartment as it is. Raskolnikov wonders whether he will be able to withstand any form of questioning at the station. He walks in, half believing he will kneel down and confess all at the first chance. A clerk directs him to a lieutenant's office, where he finds 2 women in conversation with a young official, aged 22. The room is dank, hot, and uncomfortable. Raskolnikov looks at the young official, the assistant to the police chief, who asks him his business. The clerk announces that Raskolnikov is the former student who owes back rent. When the official complains that Raskolnikov is late, Raskolnikov answers that he was only given word of the summons recently. The official tells Raskolnikov to stop shouting, and Raskolnikov answers that it is the official who is shouting, not he. The clerk explains that the piece of paper is a request for payment on a promissory note, signed by Raskolnikov 9 months ago, which his landlady has redeemed, forcing Raskolnikov to pay. Raskolnikov dimly recognizes what the paper means and, as if mechanically, understands that this police visit has nothing to do with the murder. Meanwhile, Ilya Petrovich, the young official, has begun yelling at one of the seated ladies, magnificently dressed, at whose house some debauchery transpired the previous night. Ilya Petrovich yells at the woman and warns her that, if any other scandal takes place at her house, any other drunken argument, she will be in significant trouble. Nikodem Fomitch, the chief of police, at that moment enters and is informed by Ilya, called Lieutenant Gunpowder by Nikodem, of Raskolnikov's situation. The chief is understanding and Raskolnikov explains his current poverty. He adds, further, that he had promised to marry his landlord's daughter, who died, and he had an agreement with his landlord that she would never turn in Raskolnikov's promissory note to the police, thus forcing him to pay. All listen to Raskolnikov's speech, although the lieutenant ends by saying that Raskolnikov had no need to share such private details. The clerk dictates a letter to Raskolnikov, which Raskolnikov dutifully copies, an acknowledgement of his circumstances and promise, eventually, to repay, and the clerk files this letter as an official response to the note. Raskolnikov, meanwhile, has the feeling that he can no longer interact with the room full of people, that something has happened to him that has changed his relationships to other human beings. Raskolnikov signs the paper and feels weak. He overhears the chief and the lieutenant discussing the fate of two men, Kok and the young man, who are being questioned about the murder of the old woman and Lizaveta. Nikodem relates that the murderer must have escaped Kok and the young man when both were downstairs seeking the caretaker. Ilya finds the case confusing, and the clerk wonders how anyone could have escaped that house without arousing suspicion. Raskolnikov, overhearing this, faints while attempting to leave. He is roused by the men and asked by the chief if he is ill. Raskolnikov replies that he is, and has been since yesterday. The lieutenant questions him on the exact time of his illness, and the police then let him go, although Raskolnikov senses a special tone in the lieutenant's voice. He returns home feeling that the police suspect him, and that he must prepare for a search of his person and property. Chapter 2. Raskolnikov worries that a search has already been conducted in his apartment, but none has. He finally takes inventory of the stolen materials. 8 items, including 2 small boxes, a chain, a medal, and other small cases. He walks outside with the materials in his pocket and is determined to dispose of them. He thinks of throwing the items in the canal but realizes there is no place he can throw them undetected, and he worries that they might float to the surface. He goes to a larger river, the Neva, but does not throw them in there, and instead decides to bury them. He finds a large stone, about 50 pounds in weight, in an abandoned yard near a workshop. He rolls the stone over, places the stolen items underneath, and rolls it back in place. Raskolnikov walks away and recounts the humiliation he experienced that day, airing his problems to the lieutenant. He realizes, suddenly, that he has not even examined the contents of the purse before hiding everything away. He wonders why. If he killed the old woman to rob her, he is not more interested in the items he has stolen. But he recognizes, too, that he had not cared about these items even in stealing them. He begins feeling more and more sick. He finds that he has walked, as if automatically, to his friend Razumikin's house. He walks up to the 5th floor and knocks, finding him at home. Razumikin is shocked by Raskolnikov's appearance, finds him looking physically ill, and believes he is raving about things, as though he is going insane. Raskolnikov says he is not insane, and gets up to leave. Razumikin, again surprised, offers to split his translation work with Raskolnikov in order to give him a little bit of money. Razumikin gives his friend pages to translate and an advance on wages, but Raskolnikov refuses them and runs outside. On the street, he is nearly hit by a wagon, and an onlooker claims some indigent men get hit purposely by carriages in order to demand compensation. A woman gives him 20 kopecks, thinking he is a beggar and in dire straits. He finds himself overlooking the palace and a large part of Petersburg, a view he had often taken in as a student, and which filled him with a kind of wonder and shade of sadness. He considers what has passed between his student days and the present, and throws the woman's kopecks into the water below. He walks for several hours and returns to his apartment, falls asleep, and awakes in the evening to the sound of the lieutenant thrashing and screaming at his landlady. Nastasia comes upstairs offering Raskolnikov food, and he asks her why the lieutenant has arrived and gotten so angry. Nastasia replies that it is the blood, and Raskolnikov is frightened. She goes on to say that no one was present, there was no lieutenant at the house, and by blood, she meant the beating of the blood behind his ears, on account of his fever. Raskolnikov grows weak and falls asleep again. Chapter 3. Although in a state of near delirium, Raskolnikov remembers some of what happens next. He senses that numerous people are in the room, and then Nastasia alone. He awakes around 10 a.m. the next day, with Nastasia and an unknown man in the room. Raskolnikov asks the man to identify himself, and Razumikin enters, saying he brought Zosimov the doctor to him twice in his sleep. The man introduces himself to Raskolnikov as a merchant's agent and representative of Vakrushin, the man who controls his mother's pension. The agent asks Raskolnikov to sign a receipt for 35 rubles sent by his mother. Raskolnikov initially does not wish to sign, but Razumikin convinces him, and the money is laid out. The agent departs. Razumikin encourages Raskolnikov to eat soup and asks Nastasia to bring beer and tea. Raskolnikov follows orders meekly, believing it might be his advantage to conceal his strength and presence of mind, and pretend to be sicker than he is. Razumikin tells how he found Raskolnikov's lodgings via the government registry. Razumikin has come to learn of Raskolnikov's behavior in the police station and has met the chief, the lieutenant, and Zamyatov, the clerk. And he has sweet-talked Raskolnikov's landlady, courting her and praising her to Raskolnikov. Although the landlady had decided to chase Raskolnikov out of the apartment, Razumikin has convinced her she ought to care for Raskolnikov and give him more time to pay, since he was, after all, engaged to her daughter. Razumikin learns more about Raskolnikov's mother and sister through the landlady, and tells Raskolnikov he even brought Zamyatov the clerk to visit during Raskolnikov's delirium. This latter piece of information startles and worries the already nervous Raskolnikov. Razumikin tells Raskolnikov he had been raving in his sleep about scraps of cloth and the interaction with the police, although Razumikin seems to suspect nothing other than the side effects of feverish illness. Razumikin leaves and Raskolnikov leaps out of bed, scanning the room for bits of evidence. No one seems to have suspected anything, nor has the room been searched. He intends to go out and rent another apartment, fleeing everyone entirely, but he drinks most of a beer and falls back asleep. Razumikin wakes up him several hours later, having arrived with new clothes for his friend. Razumikin shows him a new hat, shirt, trousers, and boots, all purchased with the money Pulcheria sent. Raskolnikov initially does not want to change, but Razumikin convinces him. Raskolnikov briefly forgets how Razumikin came upon this money, thus worrying his friend with his continued delirium and weakness. At this moment, Zosimov the doctor enters to examine Raskolnikov. Chapter 4. Zosimov is a young man of 27, well-dressed, with an imperious air. Zosimov examines Raskolnikov and determines that he is getting better, although he should continue to rest and avoid unnecessary agitation. Razumikin reminds Zosimov of his housewarming party that night and expresses a desire that Raskolnikov be permitted to attend. Porfiry, a police inspector and investigator and distant relative of Razumikin's, has been invited, along with Zamyatov the clerk. Zosimov begins to criticize Zamyatov for having an open palm, being open to bribes, and Razumikin interrupts to say he is defending the house painters in the case of the old woman and Lizaveta. Raskolnikov is again disturbed at mention of the murder and turns on his sofa to face the wall. Razumikin believes the house painters are innocent and that they have been unfairly accused by Koch and Pestryakov, the young officer. Zosimov asks why the painters are under suspicion. Razumikin informs him that Mikolai, one of the painters, pawned off 2 gold earrings he claimed to have found on the sidewalk on the day of the murders. The man to whom he pawned them, Dushkin, heard of the murders and questioned him. Mikolai ran away, was later arrested, and even attempted to hang himself in police custody. Finally, after the investigators asked why Mikolai was afraid of the police if he was innocent of the murders, he said he'd initially lied. He found the earrings in the apartment they were painting, after having ducked outside during an argument with Mitka, Maitreyi, the other painter. Raskolnikov sits up and asks where the earrings were found, realizing they must have fallen from his pockets when he hid from Koch and Pestryakov. Mikolai is still in custody for the murders, although Razumikin believes in his innocence, since he knows further psychological evidence in their favor. Razumikin claims that numerous witnesses attest to seeing the painters fighting in the building's courtyard. This is the same squabble drawing the painters out of the apartment, allowing Raskolnikov to enter and hide. Razumikin argues that their playful fighting is not in keeping with the horrible nature of the murder, which would have occurred just previously. He believes this evidence outweighs the disputable physical evidence the earrings appear to provide. Razumikin deduces that the real murderer dropped the earrings while avoiding detection. Zosimov finds this explanation clever, like a stage play. Chapter 5. A new and unknown man walks in, asking for Raskolnikov, who Razumikin indicates, brusquely, is the man lying on the sofa. The new man is taken aback by this rudeness, but recovers and introduces himself as Pyotr Petrovich Luzin. Raskolnikov appears not to remember Luzin's name, despite having read his mother's recent letter, and Luzin is confused and embarrassed. Razumikin asks him to step inside and sit down. Razumikin informs Luzin of Raskolnikov's illness. Luzin worries that conversation might further upset the sick man, but Zosimov says it might actually be good for him. Just as Luzin begins to speak, Raskolnikov cuts him off, saying he knows he is the fiancé. Luzin tells Raskolnikov that he has rented 2 rooms in an apartment Razumikin claims is filthy and dilapidated, and that he is furnishing his marital apartment and staying, in the meantime, in Frau Lipwechsel's with his friend Lebeziatnikov. Luzin says he learns much from Lebeziatnikov, because the latter is a man of new ideas, meaning a liberal. Luzin admits that, though he is older, he finds the new ideas exciting, including those espousing self-interest, the betterment of one's own condition first, as a means of improving society on the whole. Razumikin, however, cuts him off and implies that Luzin merely wishes to demonstrate his intellect. Luzin is offended and begins to leave. Continuing their previous conversation, Zosimov says to Razumikin that the old lady's killer must have been one of her clients. Raskolnikov is upset to learn that Porfiry, the investigator, is interviewing the old lady's clients. Razumikin also explains that the details of the murder, and the way only some goods were stolen, indicates that it was the criminal's first attempt at such a crime, and that he lost his head while committing it. Luzin, Razumikin, and Zosimov discuss the murder and other recent crimes in Moscow, among the upper, educated classes. Suddenly Raskolnikov interjects that the pawnbroker's murder is in line with Luzin's theory that self-interest can be used to improve the world. Luzin is taken aback at this. Raskolnikov asks Luzin to verify that he indeed said a woman married in dire financial straits makes a better, more grateful wife. Luzin argues that his words were misrepresented in Pulcheria's letter, but Raskolnikov does not permit Luzin to finish speaking and instead demands that he not use his mother's name again. Raskolnikov avers that he is not sick after all, and he tells everyone, Luzin foremost, to leave. Luzin is greatly insulted, and Razumikin and Zosimov, heading out, discuss how upset Raskolnikov appears to get on mention of the pawnbroker's murder. Raskolnikov turns to the wall to sleep. Chapter 6. Raskolnikov quickly dresses in his news clothes, pockets the 25 rubles and change left behind by Razumikin after the clothing purchases, and slips outside unnoticed. On his way to the Haymarket, he spots a young girl of 15 singing and accompanied by an organ grinder. He gives the girl 5 kopecks and asks a bystander if he enjoys music, but the bystander is frightened by Raskolnikov and hurries away. Raskolnikov passes through the Haymarket and continues to a building filled with taverns and bars. He approaches one, is propositioned by a prostitute, and gives her a few kopecks before walking away. He remarks to himself something he once read somewhere, that if man were to live on a narrow ledge, with only 2 feet allotted him, still that would be better than death. He walks into a tavern called the Crystal Palace and asks for tea and some old newspapers. Raskolnikov begins reading but is interrupted by Zamiatov, the clerk, who is surprised to see the ailing Raskolnikov out of the house. Raskolnikov indicates to Zamiatov what he knows, that Zamiatov visited him in his delirium, that he looked for Raskolnikov's sock, about which he was raving, and that the painter is being held for the murder of the 2 women. Raskolnikov jokes with Zamiatov, claiming the latter enjoys many people's generosity, Another hint that Zamyatov can be bribed, in calling him an educated man. Raskolnikov tells him, eagerly, that he has been reading about the murder case. Zamyatov wonders why he ought to care, but Raskolnikov insists on the subject, saying it was the same one discussed just before he fainted in the police station. Zamyatov is perplexed by Raskolnikov's joking attitude and repeated reference to the murder. He says Raskolnikov must either be crazy but he trails off. The two discuss a recent counterfeiting trial in Moscow, and Raskolnikov calls those criminals beginners. Raskolnikov tells Zamyatov how he would have arranged the counterfeiting so as not to be caught, but Zamyatov doesn't believe he could pull off the crime so easily. Zamyatov brings the conversation back to the murder case. He claims that the criminal did a poor job of things, and Raskolnikov counters that they ought to catch the perpetrator. Then, Raskolnikov tells Zamyatov how he would act if he were the killer. He would take the valuables and hide them under a stone, someplace far away. Zamyatov takes this joke gravely, and Raskolnikov asks what Zamyatov would do if he, Raskolnikov, were in fact the killer. Zamyatov turns white, but Raskolnikov pretends he was joking. Zamyatov believes he was joking, and, getting up to leave, Raskolnikov flaunts the money he has just received from his mother, asking Zamyatov how he has come upon so much, and new clothes, too, in the day since the murder. As he is leaving, Raskolnikov runs into Razumikin, who chastises him for going out of the house in his condition. Raskolnikov tells his friend he no longer desires his charity. Razumikin is offended but nevertheless wishes to convince Raskolnikov to come to his housewarming party that night. Raskolnikov heads outside and arrives at a bridge, where a tall woman looks at him and silently jumps off the bridge in an attempt to drown herself. People gather around in horror, and the woman is rescued and returned to life, coughing and sputtering. The episode causes Raskolnikov to rethink his initial plan, which he only now realizes fully, that he left the house tonight to kill himself. He is now disgusted at the thought of suicide. He begins walking, at first headed to the police station, but then finds he is in front of the old woman's house. He enters, walks up to the 4th floor, and finds 2 workmen in the apartment, which has been renovated. Raskolnikov says that he wishes to rent the apartment. The workmen are confused because he has come at night, unannounced, without the caretaker. Raskolnikov asks if any blood remains in the apartment. He offers to explain all to the police. He walks to the courtyard with the workmen, who explain to the caretaker and others gathered there that Raskolnikov has said ominous things about the murders in the apartment. They do not take him to the police, but instead throw him out into the street. Raskolnikov notices a commotion and resolves that, now it is all going to end. Chapter 7. A man has been crushed by the wheels of a wagon and is lying in the street, mortally wounded. Raskolnikov realizes he knows this man. It is Marmeladov, the drunken former official. Raskolnikov says he will pay for a doctor and asks for help to carry Marmeladov to the Lipwechsel's house, not far away. Marmeladov's wife Katerina has become more crazed since Raskolnikov last visited. She often speaks about her father's high rank and the squalor of their current circumstances. When Marmeladov is brought in, Katerina remarks that he finally got it. A crowd has begun to gather at the apartment's doorway. Katerina rushes into action and is extremely upset. She sends her oldest daughter Polenka to fetch Sonia. Raskolnikov calls for a doctor, who lives close by. The landlord Amalia, Frau Lipwechsel, arrives and begins fighting with Katerina. Lebeziatnikov is also present, Luzin's roommate. The doctor arrives and informs Raskolnikov that there is no hope. Marmeladov will die in short order. A priest is called and administers last rites. Katerina cries with the children and Polenka returns with Sonia. Katerina asks the priest what she will do with the children after Marmeladov's death. She says she cannot forgive Marmeladov for his drunkenness. The priest argues that this lack of forgiveness is a great sin. Marmeladov sees Sonia, asks her for forgiveness, then dies. Katerina asks who will provide for the funeral expenses. Raskolnikov gives Katerina 20 rubles for the funeral. As he is leaving, he sees Nikodim, the police chief, who tells Raskolnikov he is soaked in Marmeladov's blood. Raskolnikov agrees. As he is walking outside, Polenka, sent by Sonia, asks for Raskolnikov's name. He tells Polenka to pray for her father and for himself. Raskolnikov feels that his strength has returned, and that life might be possible after the murder of the crone, after all. Raskolnikov heads to Razumikin's party. Razumikin is shocked by Raskolnikov's frazzled appearance and offers to take him home. He has just been having an involved political conversation with Zosimov and others at the party. Zosimov looks Raskolnikov over and orders him home, to bed. Razumikin tells his friend that Zosimov believes Raskolnikov might be insane. Zosimov feels this way because of Raskolnikov's recent behavior, especially his strange conversation with Zamyatov at the Crystal Palace Tavern and Raskolnikov's fainting spell at the police station. While mounting the stairs to his room, Raskolnikov tells Razumikin of Marmeladov's death. It appears that someone is in the room. Pulcheria and Dunya are there. They have been waiting for Raskolnikov for an hour and a half. They are happy to see Raskolnikov, but terrified by his appearance. Raskolnikov lies down, and the two become acquainted with Razumikin and filled in on their son's circumstances. Part 3. Chapter 1. Raskolnikov awakes and asks his mother and sister to leave, to give him peace and stop tormenting him. Both are reluctant to do so. They say they know Luzin has visited that day. Raskolnikov tells Dunya he does not approve of the marriage and wishes that his sister break off the relationship. Dunya says that Raskolnikov has no right to forbid her. Razumikin escorts both out of the room, hoping to smooth things over while Raskolnikov continues his recovery. Razumikin, in his drunkenness, calls Luzin a scoundrel for providing the two with such poor lodgings. He offers them his unreserved help and support. He holds both tightly as he tells them his plan. He will walk with them back to their lodgings, check on Raskolnikov, bring them a report of his health, go back to his party and get Zosimov, send Zosimov to check on Raskolnikov, then report again to Dunya and Pulcheria. It is clear, also, that Razumikin has taken a liking to Dunya, whom, he believes, will make Raskolnikov's landlady, whom he has been courting, jealous. On his walk back to their lodgings, he tells them that, although he is drunk, he loves them a great deal. Razumikin also lets slip that Zosimov fears Raskolnikov might be mentally unstable. Razumikin complains, confusedly, to Pulcheria and Dunya of the argument he had at his apartment, with those who preach the new ways, not dissimilar from Luzin's previous arguments at Raskolnikov's. Pulcheria seems not to understand. Dunya agrees somewhat, but mostly wishes to change the subject. Razumikin repeats that Luzin is a scoundrel, though he immediately regrets his behavior. Razumikin deposits the two at their apartment. Dunya appears to like Razumikin, though she knows he has been on a binge. Pulcheria is so worried about Raskolnikov, she does not know what to think. Razumikin has fallen for Dunya, who is a remarkable beauty with a gentle, intelligent nature. Razumikin checks on Raskolnikov, who is sleeping, and reports this news to Dunya and Pulcheria. Zosimov also checks on Raskolnikov and reports, succinctly, that his illness is caused mostly by his poverty and by other circumstances of environment. He says that his previous comments on Raskolnikov's madness have been exaggerated. He believes the condition will pass. Zosimov remarks to Razumikin, outside, that Dunya is a ravishing beauty. Razumikin, still drunk, rushes at him and pronounces her too fine and lovely a woman to be talked of by such a philanderer as Zosimov. Razumikin explains that he has been courting Raskolnikov's landlady, mostly to make things easier materially for Raskolnikov. He says that Zosimov might enjoy doing the same. This would allow Razumikin to pursue Dunya. The two part, with Razumikin asking the doctor to check on Raskolnikov once again later on. Chapter 2. Razumikin awakes with some regret about his behavior the previous day. He is particularly ashamed of the attention he showed Dunya, and of his negative comments about Luzin. He strikes his stove out of anger at himself, hurting his hand. He dresses for the day with special care, and resolves not to bring up his behavior yesterday with Dunya and Pulcheria. Zosimov arrives and chastises Razumikin for referring again to the murders in Raskolnikov's presence the previous day. Zosimov believes Raskolnikov suffers from a monomaniacal obsession with the crime, though for unknown reasons. Zosimov reports that Raskolnikov's landlady was not interested in his advances. Razumikin visits Dunya and Pulcheria at their lodgings. They are happy to see him, and he describes in greater detail Raskolnikov's illness of the past few days. Pulcheria asks Razumikin more questions about Raskolnikov's condition. Razumikin replies that he is not a hypochondriac, just inhumanly cold and callous. Dunya thanks Razumikin for his honesty, and Pulcheria tells them that Raskolnikov has always been capricious, even as a young man. She is surprised by news of his engagement to the landlady's daughter, broken only by the daughter's death. The girl was sickly and strange, and all agree it is better that the relationship is over. Razumikin recounts Raskolnikov's reaction to Luzin the previous day. Unlike the night before, Razumikin refuses to speak badly of Luzin. Pulcheria shows a letter from Luzin and asks Razumikin's advice. In the letter, Luzin says he will visit Dunya and Pulcheria the next day at 8 p.m., and he asks that Raskolnikov not be present. Luzin reports that he saw Raskolnikov the day before at Marmeladov's. Luzin lives in the same apartment building, and that Raskolnikov gave 25 rubles to Sonia instead of to Katerina. Razumikin recommends that Pulcheria follow Dunya's preferred course of action and have Raskolnikov present at the meeting, despite Luzin's wishes. The three head to Raskolnikov's apartment, and Pulcheria tells Razumikin that Marfa Petrovna has died, although Dunya reminds her mother that Razumikin does not know who Marfa is. Chapter 3. The three find Raskolnikov and Zosimov, who declares Raskolnikov well. The latter appears cleaned and more presentable, though there is a look of anguish fixed on his face. Zosimov urges Raskolnikov to find the original causes of his temporary madness and discomfort, and recommends a return to steady work and university life, to which Raskolnikov seems to assent. Raskolnikov appears to apologize, however mechanically, to his mother for his previous behavior, and he reaches out to touch his sister's hand, signifying reconciliation. Pulcheria reiterates her concerns about her son's health, and Raskolnikov appears to explain his behavior, as Dunya recognizes, as if by rote. Raskolnikov refers both to his rationality and his apparent delirium the previous day, and Zosimov seems to agree that the patient was acting as though not quite sane nor mad, but rather in a dream. Raskolnikov explains Marmeladov's death and tells his family, apologetically, that he gave the 25 rubles to Katerina for the funeral. His mother is convinced of Raskolnikov's goodness. Raskolnikov realizes his family is afraid of him. Pulcheria tells her son that Marfa Svidrigailov died, suddenly, of a stroke after being beaten by her husband. Raskolnikov asks why his mother is telling him this, and Dunya intercedes, saying they both are afraid of him. Raskolnikov grows upset and yells at everyone, saying they are dull and asking them to speak. Razumikin speaks of his engagement to the landlady's daughter, indicating that it was a mistake, an instance of spring delirium. Pulcheria wonders if Raskolnikov's condition doesn't derive from the squalor of his apartment. Raskolnikov repeats to his sister, with apologies, that he cannot support her marriage to Luzin. Dunya says she is marrying for her own reasons, not for her brother's sake. Raskolnikov says that it is low and base to marry only for money. Dunya yells that it is not as though she has put in a knife in someone, and Raskolnikov nearly faints. His anger passes, however, and Raskolnikov tells his sister to marry whomever she wishes. Raskolnikov reads Luzin's recent letter and corrects Luzin, saying that he gave the money to Katerina, not to Sonia. He believes Luzin is trying to impute a base motive to Raskolnikov in connecting him to a known prostitute. Raskolnikov says he will be present at the meeting tomorrow at 8 p.m. Chapter 4. Sonia arrives at Raskolnikov's apartment, abashedly, and Raskolnikov realizes that her arrival in the room seems to indicate that they are on close terms, which in fact they are not. Raskolnikov nevertheless invites her in and asks her to sit. Sonia brings a message from Katerina that Raskolnikov be so kind as to attend Marmeladov's funeral the following morning. Sonia says her mother will also be preparing a funeral meal with Raskolnikov's money. Pulcheria and Dunya leave together. Outside, Pulcheria tells Dunya that Raskolnikov appears quite ill. Pulcheria believes that Sonia might be at the root of her son's troubles, but Dunya blames Luzin for planting this idea in her mother's head. Back in Raskolnikov's room, Sonia stays while Razumikin tells his friend that Porfiry, the investigator, is interviewing those who have pawned items with the old crone. Raskolnikov admits that he pawned some items there and tells Razumikin he fears these items might have been stolen by the murderer. They resolve to see Porfiry. Sonia thanks Raskolnikov again for his kindness. Raskolnikov promises to visit Sonia, which makes her nervous because she lives in such a small room. A man of about 50 follows Sonia home, and when she reaches her building, he announces, oddly, to her that it is his third day in Petersburg, and they are neighbors in a Kapernaum's house. Walking to Porfiry's, Razumikin is curious about when Raskolnikov pawned items at the old crone's, and seems reassured to note that his friend's ravings regarding the murder might be traced to his business relationship with the woman. Raskolnikov grows nervous as they approach Porfiry's office, and tells himself he must act naturally and betray no special interest in the case. Raskolnikov changes the subject by remarking on Razumikin's happiness and enlivened appearance, hinting that Razumikin has a romantic interest in Dunya. Chapter 5. Raskolnikov and Razumikin enter Porfiry's office laughing, lending, in Raskolnikov's mind, a natural air to his behavior. Razumikin introduces Raskolnikov and Zamyatov enters. Raskolnikov begins losing his natural air and grows nervous. Raskolnikov informs Porfiry of his story, that he was merely a customer of the pawnbrokers who now seeks to find his stolen goods. Porfiry tells Raskolnikov to make a statement to the police. Raskolnikov fears that Porfiry knows he is the murderer. Porfiry reveals that he has been waiting for Raskolnikov. 2 pawned items with his name on them were recovered from the apartment. Raskolnikov is the only pawner not yet to have visited. Raskolnikov grows pale and claims he was in a delirium yesterday, but not a complete delirium, and he stumbles in describing his condition. He asks Zamyatov to corroborate, based on their conversation yesterday. Zamyatov believes Raskolnikov spoke intelligently, but he was irritable. Raskolnikov fears that Porfiry has learned, also, of his visit to the pawnbroker's apartment after the murder. The conversation turns to Razumikin's argument with Porfiry from the previous day's party. Razumikin begins criticizing a supposed socialist view of crime, which blames criminality on the perpetrator's environment. Porfiry argues that environment is responsible for some amount of all crimes. He then references an article written, semi-anonymously, by Raskolnikov on the nature of crime. Raskolnikov remembers having written it, but did not know it was recently published. The article describes the psychology of a person committing a crime, and derives from Raskolnikov's studies as a law student. Porfiry is struck in particular by the end, which argues, for some extraordinary individuals, ordinary laws do not apply and indeed these laws must be broken. Raskolnikov attempts to clarify his statement, saying that great men, as determined by society, often break the laws of their time in the formation of new laws or a new morality. He cites Napoleon as an example. Porfiry asks whether Raskolnikov believes in God, the New Testament, and in particular the story of Lazarus, who was raised from the dead by Jesus in the book of John. Porfiry goes on to ask how one might know if a person is ordinary or extraordinary, and what happens if a person is misidentified. Raskolnikov replies that a person who is ordinary but pretends be extraordinary will eventually be found out, before he has caused too much trouble. Raskolnikov also states that the truly extraordinary are extremely rare. Raskolnikov also separates suffering and guilt from the ability to commit a crime, arguing that even great individuals, who are permitted by society to overstep the bounds of the law, will feel some pang of conscience for the harm they do. The question is whether they can overcome this pang and be convinced of the eventual rightness of their actions. Razumikin asks whether Raskolnikov considers himself an extraordinary person permitted to commit crimes, only half seriously. Raskolnikov says that, if he were, he wouldn't announce it publicly. He adds that he does not believe he is a Napoleon. Porfiry has a final question for Raskolnikov before the latter leaves. He asks if Raskolnikov saw the painters on the day of his visit to the pawnbroker. Carefully weighing his words to avoid the trap, a nervous Raskolnikov admits he was there on the day of the murder but claims not to have seen the painters. Razumikin, however, steps in and asks Porfiry what he's getting at. Since the painters were there on the day of the murder and Raskolnikov only visited the pawnbroker 3 days before that to pawn the watch, Porfiry says that he's mixed up the details, and Razumikin warns him to be more careful. Then, Porfiry quickly escorts Raskolnikov and Razumikin out of the office. Chapter 6. Raskolnikov leaves quite angrily and can't believe he has betrayed some part of his lie to Porfiry. He resents that he has been suspected without even a shred of physical evidence. Razumikin, relieved to be discussing the murder out in the open, admits he has sensed Porfiry's suspicions but cannot understand why, since Raskolnikov has clearly been ill on account of his family troubles and grinding poverty. Raskolnikov worries, to himself, that Porfiry has figured out the case. Raskolnikov argues that, had he committed the crime, he would have admitted to seeing the painters, since it behooves a criminal to admit as much as he can to officials, strategically, in order to throw them off the scent. Razumikin goes up to visit Dunya and Pulcheria, and Raskolnikov leaves in a huff, returning to his apartment. As he arrives, he learns from the caretaker that a man has come by asking after Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov runs after the man, a tradesman, who tells Raskolnikov that he is a murderer and walks away. Raskolnikov returns to his room, notably weakened, and is caught again in a flurry of anxieties. He awakes to find Razumikin and Nastasia present. They leave quickly thereafter. Raskolnikov wonders who this man from underground, the tradesman, might be. Raskolnikov curses himself for not being a great man after all. He was able to kill, but not able to step over. To justify his killing is part of some new principle. He lacks the courage and willpower of a man like Napoleon or Muhammad. He then thinks of poor Lizaveta and Sonia, the weak of the earth, and remarks that he rarely considers the fact that he murdered the pawnbroker's innocent sister. He falls asleep and, in a dream, follows the tradesman to the pawnbroker's house, up to the 4th floor. He discovers that the old crone is still there, seated silently, her face obscured, and when he tries to hit her on the head with an axe, he feels she is made of wood. He flees the building, where many people have gathered to observe him, and wakes up to find a man in the room. Raskolnikov pretends he is still sleeping but eventually wakes. Svidrigailov introduces himself and says he knew Raskolnikov was not really asleep. Part 4. Chapter 1. Svidrigailov immediately addresses his relationship with Dunya, arguing that his behavior toward her was based only on genuine respect and affection. Raskolnikov tells Svidrigailov he has heard rumors he killed his wife Marfa. Svidrigailov replies that his wife's death was caused by apoplexy after a heavy meal, and that he only beat her sparingly during their marriage. Raskolnikov wishes to go but finds he somewhat enjoys talking to Svidrigailov. Raskolnikov admits that Svidrigailov seems a kind of gentleman. Svidrigailov complains that Petersburg is only a city of functionaries. Svidrigailov tells about his life. He was a sharper or cheater at card games, and he ended up in significant debt for which authorities would put him in prison. He met Marfa, who paid off his debt and married him. He promised to live under her rules in the provinces, and after a time, she gave him a part of her fortune. Svidrigailov asks Raskolnikov if he believes in ghosts. Svidrigailov says that sometimes he senses Marfa's presence. Raskolnikov does not believe him, but Svidrigailov says Marfa does return, mostly to remind him to do household chores. Raskolnikov says Svidrigailov ought to see a doctor. Svidrigailov responds that it is possible that sick, raving people claim to see ghosts, but he says it is also possible that ghosts choose to visit only sick people in the first place. Svidrigailov goes on to say that the afterlife might be something like a bathhouse where one waits, complete with spiders in the corners. Raskolnikov thinks that Svidrigailov is insane. Raskolnikov becomes upset, finally, and asks Svidrigailov his business. The latter asks whether Dunya is to marry Luzin. Svidrigailov says he suspects Raskolnikov does not approve of the marriage, which is to be conducted out of Dunya's sacrifice and for Raskolnikov's monetary advantage. Svidrigailov wishes for Raskolnikov to arrange a meeting with Dunya, whereby he can convince her not to marry Luzin and instead to accept 10,000 of his rubles. Svidrigailov says he is already engaged and has no need for the money, nor does he pine for Dunya any longer. Svidrigailov hints ominously that, if Raskolnikov does not set up the meeting, Svidrigailov will find Dunya himself. In the meantime, he is planning a voyage far away. Svidrigailov announces, finally, that Marfa left Dunya 3,000 rubles in her will, and that this money will be available in a few weeks. Chapter 2. Raskolnikov meets with Razumikin and tells him the man leaving his apartment was Svidrigailov. Raskolnikov hopes that Razumikin also saw him. He is worried he has been having hallucinations. Razumikin reports of a dinner he had with Porfiry and Zamyatov. He was unable to bring up their suspicions about Raskolnikov's involvement in the murder, but he remarks that, since Raskolnikov is obviously not the killer, they have nothing to fear. Raskolnikov worries what Razumikin will think of him when he learns the truth. They run into Luzin as they enter Pulcheria and Dunya's quarters. They all discuss, briefly, Marfa's death, and Dunya learns that Svidrigailov has come to Petersburg. Luzin says that Svidrigailov is a depraved man, that he hopes he has no further interaction with Dunya, and that Marfa might have gotten him acquitted of a serious crime against a young girl in addition to paying off his debts before their marriage. Dunya says that this and another mysterious death of Svidrigailov's servant Philip were apparent suicides. Luzin hints that Dunya is justifying Svidrigailov's actions. Raskolnikov announces that Svidrigailov has already paid him a visit and that Marfa left Dunya 3,000 rubles. Pulcheria is very pleased. Luzin gets up to leave, but is stayed by Dunya, who reminds him he has something to tell them. Luzin begins saying he cannot countenance Raskolnikov's rude behavior of the previous day. Dunya orders that Luzin and Raskolnikov forgive each other. Otherwise, she will have to choose between brother and fiancé. Luzin claims that it is unfair for him to be placed on the same level as Raskolnikov, whom he considers young and rude. Luzin argues Raskolnikov has misrepresented his opinions regarding marriage and poverty. Pulcheria counters that Luzin has lied about Raskolnikov's actions the night of Marmeladov's death, for he gave the rubles not to Sonia but to Katerina. Raskolnikov reports that Sonia, too, is not so fallen and depraved a person. He has even invited her, earlier, to sit with his family in his quarters. Luzin grows angry when Pulcheria tells him that they have moved to Petersburg and abandoned all to meet him, and that they are, in fact, under his power. Pulcheria hints that Luzin wishes things to be this way after all. He wishes to have control of Dunya and her mother. When Luzin then implies that Dunya is receptive to Svidrigailov's offers, she kicks him out the apartment, effectively ending their engagement on the spot. Yet he still believes, inwardly, that there is a chance to repair their relationship. Chapter 3. Luzin is most shocked that Pulcheria, Dunya, and Raskolnikov do not view him as a benefactor and protector. He worries about Svidrigailov, whom he considers a rival for Dunya's affections. Back in the lodgings, Dunya apologizes to her family for the engagement to such an unworthy man. Pulcheria is excited about Dunya's inheritance from Marfa. Razumikin feels free to love Raskolnikov's sister. Raskolnikov sits quietly. Raskolnikov tells his mother and sister of Svidrigailov's offer of 10,000 rubles. Dunya fears Svidrigailov's attentions and Razumikin promises to protect the family from harm, even offering to invest some of Dunya's inheritance in a small publishing business focusing on translations. As Razumikin, Dunya, and Pulcheria make their plans, Raskolnikov says he must go, and adds ominously that it's not as though they are saying goodbye forever. Raskolnikov stammers and, finally, says that it is better if they do not see each other for a while. Razumikin is shocked and follows Raskolnikov, asking what is the matter. As they stand in the hallway, Raskolnikov tells Razumikin not to leave his family, and they stare into each other's eyes. The hint of some idea, something horrible, is detectable. Razumikin turns pale at the thought. The narrator says he will not detail how Razumikin consoled Dunya and Pulcheria, but he adds that, from this time on, Razumikin was truly their son and brother. Chapter 4. Raskolnikov heads to Sonia's apartment, in the home of Kapernaumov the tailor. He knocks, and she allows him to enter. The room is spare and barely furnished. Raskolnikov says he has come to her for the last time. Sonia asks whether he will not be at her father's funeral tomorrow. Raskolnikov remarks on the thinness of Sonia's fingers, and Sonia says she thought she saw an image of her father earlier in the day. When Raskolnikov accuses Katerina of having beaten Sonia, Sonia says that she loves her stepmother and recognizes that she, Sonia, must work now to protect the family. Sonia reports that Katerina has begun believing in her fantasies, that she can throw a large funeral banquet for Marmeladov being among them. Sonia pities her stepmother and asks Raskolnikov to do the same. She lets slip that she knew Lizaveta, sister to the pawnbroker. Raskolnikov seizes upon this fact. Raskolnikov tells Sonia that consumption will eventually kill Katerina, and that Polenka might also be forced into prostitution to support the family. When Sonia says God will not allow such a thing, Raskolnikov asks whether God really exists. Raskolnikov says it is most pitiful that Sonia has degraded herself for no end, since her earnings as a prostitute cannot support her family, nor prevent Polenka from succumbing to the same. Raskolnikov thinks to himself that Sonia has only three options: to kill herself, to go insane, or to descend into depravity. He asks if Sonia prays, and she responds that she is nothing without God. Raskolnikov picks up the New Testament and asks Sonia to read to him the section in John of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. She hesitates, afraid of Raskolnikov, but begins to read. In the story of Lazarus, Jesus arrives in a town and is asked why he did not save Lazarus, who has recently died. Jesus asks God to demonstrate to the people that he has in fact come for their salvation. God grants him the power to raise Lazarus, though the man has been dead 4 days. At this point, the Jews assembled believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Sonia trembles upon finishing, and Raskolnikov tells her that today he left his mother and sister. Raskolnikov tells her, too, that they are on the same path, and that they must have freedom and power. Sonia is frightened. Raskolnikov promises that, if he returns tomorrow, he will do so to tell Sonia who killed Lizaveta. Sonia falls into a fever and worries for the remainder of the night. Meanwhile, Svidrigailov has been standing behind a adjoining wall in the apartment next door the whole time, and has heard their conversation. He plans to bring a seat the next time to listen to what Raskolnikov reveals. Chapter 5. Raskolnikov visits Porfiry at his office. Though he realizes he hates him, he knows that he must speak with him immediately. Porfiry greets him casually, and Raskolnikov wishes to speak about the murder without giving himself away. Porfiry, however, begins talking aimlessly, and Raskolnikov wonders aloud whether he isn't trying to lull Raskolnikov into a false sense of security. Porfiry responds that that is a normal police technique, and continue talking aimlessly, though claiming he is not using this very technique of police interrogation. Raskolnikov becomes flustered. He asks that Porfiry either ask him direct questions or let him go. Porfiry acknowledges that he is not following the form of a typical interrogation, but instead says that they are having a free-flowing conversation. Raskolnikov is agitated and clearly wishes to leave. Porfiry starts speaking hypothetically, referencing Raskolnikov's theoretical legal knowledge, as evidenced by his recent article on ordinary and extraordinary criminals. In this hypothetical discussion, Porfiry wonders aloud whether it isn't better, if one has a suspect and some evidence against him, to wait until one has mathematical clarity of proof against that man. He wonders further, though, whether it isn't better simply to bother that man, to stay on his trail and get into his mind. Raskolnikov recognizes that Porfiry is speaking about his involvement in the murders, but doing so with such generality that it is difficult to pin down any one statement. Porfiry begins to make more specific references to Raskolnikov's behavior, mentioning the fainting incident in the police station and Raskolnikov's playful confession to Zamiatov at the Crystal Palace. Raskolnikov retorts that he knows Porfiry is insinuating he committed the crime. He asks to be charged or let free, but not tormented. Porfiry feigns surprise, but goes on to state he knows that Raskolnikov went to see the pawnbroker's apartment and asked about the blood. Porfiry gets Raskolnikov to admit that his actions, including the visit to the apartment after the murder, were not done in delirium, but were the actions of a sane, rational individual. Raskolnikov even admits his theory that the best way to cover one's crime is to admit as much as possible in order to avoid suspicion. Yet Porfiry insists that he does not suspect Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov does not believe him, and begs Porfiry either to accuse him or let him go. Porfiry says, finally, that he has a surprise for Raskolnikov waiting behind the door. Raskolnikov believes that Porfiry has behind-the-door witnesses who can attest to his guilt, and he says that he is ready to defend himself against their accusations. Chapter 6. But the surprise is different from what Porfiry intended. Instead of witnesses, the painter Nikolai is brought in. A crowd waits in the doorway, and Nikolai confesses to the murder, saying the other painter Mika had nothing to do with it. Raskolnikov tells Porfiry with a smile that Porfiry must not have expected this outcome. Porfiry retorts that Raskolnikov must not have either. Raskolnikov replies that Nikolai's confession is no surprise at all. Raskolnikov apologizes to Porfiry for losing his temper earlier, says he must be going to Marmeladov's funeral, and finds it funny that Porfiry will attempt to dispute Nikolai's confession point by point. Porfiry admits that Raskolnikov is astute and playful, like Nikolai Gogol, the famous Russian comic writer. Raskolnikov returns to his apartment and realizes that Nikolai's confession will be suspected and eventually disproved, at which point Porfiry will come after him. Raskolnikov comforts himself by saying that Porfiry only has psychological evidence against him, but no facts. As Raskolnikov leaves to go to the funeral, he runs into the man from under the ground who had accused him, the day before, of being a murderer. The man admits that he had seen Raskolnikov leaving the apartment after asking about the blood, and that he went to Porfiry to give this shred of psychological evidence against Raskolnikov. The man apologizes, now, because Nikolai has confessed, and Raskolnikov is upset for having assumed Porfiry had more information against him. The tradesman then admits that he was the surprise Porfiry was going to spring on Raskolnikov. He was instructed to wait behind the partition and emerge later, but Nikolai beat him to it and confessed. Porfiry then questioned both Nikolai and the tradesman after Raskolnikov left. The tradesman apologizes for his slander. Raskolnikov, however, recognizes that his struggles are far from over. He repeats to himself that all the evidence and the circumstances are two-sided, and he curses himself for the weakness he displayed in Porfiry's office. Part 5. Chapter 1. Luzin awakes to find he is still upset about his interaction with Dunya and Pulcheria. He returns to his apartment and learns that he, along with Lebeziatnikov, Raskolnikov, and Amalia the landlord, have been invited to Marmeladov's funeral banquet. Luzin has a certain fascination for his roommate Lebeziatnikov, who is a representative of the younger generations and of the new, liberal ideas. But Luzin finds Lebeziatnikov to be small-minded and inarticulately passionate about his beliefs. Lebeziatnikov also finds that Luzin is an obstinate and unlikable man. They speak on the day of the funeral meal, and Luzin claims he will not attend. Lebeziatnikov says he will not either. Luzin mentions that Lebeziatnikov once beat Katerina, but Lebeziatnikov hotly denies this and says that his behavior does not violate his beliefs in women's equality. Their conversation turns to Sonia. Luzin asks whether, according to the new ideas, Sonia's prostitution is wrong. Lebeziatnikov replies that it is indeed a representation of Sonia's power and an affirmation of the new principles. Luzin ridicules Lebeziatnikov for this answer, asking whether Sonia would be allowed on the commune of Lebeziatnikov's proposed utopian society. Lebeziatnikov answers that he has been attempting to work with Sonia to educate her, and Luzin again makes light of this. Luzin continues to joke about the commune and about the proposed liberal sexual politics of such a place. Lebeziatnikov answers that Luzin is only angry because he was rebuffed yesterday by Dunya and Pulcheria. Luzin is angered, but asks Lebeziatnikov whether he can't call Sonia over to speak with them. Lebeziatnikov does so and Sonia enters. Luzin gives his condolences to Sonia and says he has something to say to her. Luzin expresses a desire to help Sonia and the family, since he recognizes that they now depend on Sonia for support. Luzin says that he wishes to give Sonia some money and not Katerina, because he feels Katerina has been profligate in her spending on the meal, and he doesn't believe she will save for the children's welfare. Luzin gives Sonia 10 rubles, and she leaves. Lebeziatnikov tells Luzin that his behavior is noble, especially considering how upset Luzin must be over the possible dissolution of his engagement. Lebeziatnikov returns to their previous conversation of utopian politics, saying he does not understand Luzin's insistence on legal marriage and children. Lebeziatnikov says that, in his proposed commune, marriage would be natural and children would be raised all together, as a society. Luzin laughs, but seems to be focused on something else. Lebeziatnikov notices this even as he continues speaking. Chapter 2. Katerina has spent nearly 10 rubles on the funeral feast, an enormous sum for her, and Sonia begins to fear that Katerina is losing her senses. Amalia, the landlady, helps Katerina in her preparations, but Katerina quickly becomes upset, wondering whether Amalia thinks she is better than Katerina and the children. Very few tenants arrive for the meal, and those who do seem only interested in eating. Raskolnikov arrives, and Katerina thanks him for coming and claims he is destined for an esteemed university job. Katerina complains to Raskolnikov of Amalia, the landlady's snobbery, and, between coughs, ridicules her other guests, whispering in his ear. Sonia enters, bringing Luzin's apologies that he cannot attend. This pleases Katerina. Katerina continues to ridicule the guests, and one remarks on Marmeladov's drinking problem, increasing her consternation. Sonia worries that her stepmother is going to cause a scene. Katerina appears to believe, based on an offhand remark of Luzin's, that she will receive part of Marmeladov's government pension, even though he served without distinction and lost his job out of drunkenness. Katerina passes around the certificate of merit she once received in school and says she plans to open a school for girls with the pension she obtains. Amalia, upset that she has been ignored at the meal, makes a pointed comment that Katerina must make sure the linens are clean at this proposed school for girls. They begin fighting, with Amalia demanding back payment for the rent, and Katerina accusing Amalia of heartlessness, since she asks for money on the day of the funeral and banquet. Amalia and Katerina insult each other and their families. Katerina does not countenance any insult to her officer father, and Amalia demands that they leave the apartment immediately because they have not paid. The children cry and others guests laugh uproariously, until Luzin enters and Katerina goes up to speak with him. Chapter 3. Katerina asks Luzin for his support in her quarrel, but Luzin replies he has instead come to speak with Sonia. Luzin announces, in a businesslike tone, that a 100-ruble note has disappeared from his room. He asks if Sonia has any knowledge of this. Sonia says she does not. Luzin then explains to all present that he gave Sonia 10 rubles to help her. He accused Sonia of stealing and Katerina grows extremely upset. Katerina goes on to say that Luzin cannot prove his assertions. Katerina turns inside out Sonia's pockets, revealing the 100-ruble note, and Amalia demands that the police be brought around to arrest Sonia. Katerina says she does not believe that Sonia has stolen, but Luzin quiets the room and offers Sonia forgiveness. At that point, though Lebeziatnikov accuses Luzin of being a vile man, Lebeziatnikov claims that Luzin placed the note in Sonia's pocket unbeknownst to her, and Lebeziatnikov assumed at the time either that Luzin was being especially generous or trying to test Sonia. He says now, however, that he understands the setup. Luzin has arranged the whole affair so he might be seen as a gracious man, capable of forgiveness. Luzin declares this is not true, but Raskolnikov speaks up and agrees with Lebeziatnikov's assertions, claiming Luzin has been dishonest with his family as well. Luzin leaves in a huff, with the room now on Lebeziatnikov's side, and the latter asks Luzin to vacate their apartment. Sonia, terribly upset, leaves, and Amalia uses this further ruckus against Katerina, demanding that her family leave the apartment immediately. Katerina puts on her shawl and goes out into the street, loudly protesting her unfair treatment, and Raskolnikov leaves amid the commotion to find Sonia at her apartment. Chapter 4. He realizes, on entering, that he must tell Sonia he has murdered Lizaveta. Sonia thanks him for defending her earlier, at the feast, and Raskolnikov goes on to ask a strange hypothetical question. Would Sonia kill Luzin in order to prevent his activities and spare Katerina and her family? Sonia replies that it is better not to kill, despite the consequences. He says he knew Sonia would answer this way, and he becomes quiet, adding he has come to ask forgiveness. Raskolnikov repeats his desire to tell Sonia who murdered Lizaveta. He says that the murderer aimed to kill and rob the pawnbroker and only murdered Lizaveta owing to her unexpected arrival. Sonia puts together that Raskolnikov is the killer and is appalled. She asks Raskolnikov what he has done to himself. Sonia promises to follow Raskolnikov wherever he goes. When Raskolnikov begins to explain why he killed the pawnbroker, Sonia wishes to justify his robbery owing to Raskolnikov's poverty and hunger. But Raskolnikov admits that his reasons for killing are far more complex and difficult to explain. He now wonders why he has confided in Sonia in the first place. Raskolnikov explains his new thoughts regarding the murder, namely, that he is not a Napoleon after all, because he has shrunk away from his deed after the fact and refuses to step over into a new society whose rules he is capable of determining. Raskolnikov tries again, explaining that his family was in dire financial circumstances and he was upset at not being able to attend university any longer. Sonia realizes, however, that Raskolnikov might be mad and that his reasons for killing might be unknowable. Raskolnikov explains once more this theory of power of extraordinary individuals in a final attempt to justify his murder, or at least clarify why he has done it. Sonia refuses his justifications and argues that Raskolnikov has simply committed a crime against man and against God. All that he can do, as a consequence, is accept suffering and redeem himself by it. Raskolnikov counters that he would confess only to men on earth, the police, and not to God, and be punished by those same men. In addition, he claims governments are allowed to kill en masse and are not punished. He claims the evidence the police have against him is two-sided, meaning it is only psychology and does not include facts pertaining to his guilt. He asks, however, if Sonia will visit him if he goes to jail. Sonia says yes. Sonia offers Raskolnikov a cross, which Raskolnikov says he will put on later, when, according to Sonia, he is ready for his redemption. Suddenly, Lebeziatnikov enters. Chapter 5. Lebeziatnikov reports that Katerina is going insane out in the streets of Petersburg. She has run to Marmeladov's old boss demanding money from him, and upon his refusal she is camped out in the streets with the children, singing and dancing for money. Lebeziatnikov says that Katerina might be convinced, through logic, that she is crazy and needs help. Raskolnikov expresses doubt that this is true. He worries inwardly that he will begin hating Sonia, even though he has just confessed all to her. Raskolnikov goes back to his apartment, where Dunya arrives, saying she has spoken to Razumikin and heard of the suspicions levied against Raskolnikov regarding the murder. Dunya says she understands why Raskolnikov is so upset, why he cannot see her or Pulcheria. Raskolnikov replies that Razumikin is a good man, implying that Dunya and he ought to marry. Dunya fears that they are saying goodbye forever. Raskolnikov wanders outside and Dunya is greatly alarmed, though she does not follow. Lebeziatnikov finds him outside and leads him to the bridge over the canal where Katerina and the children are performing. Katerina tells Sonia, who attempts to help her, to leave, and Katerina corrects the children singing and dancing. They perform and those gathering around laugh and jeer at Katerina. A policeman arrives and says that this performance is prohibited in public. Running after the dispersed crowd, Katerina falls and begins coughing up blood heavily. Sonia and the others fear that she is dying and carry her back to Sonia's apartment. Katerina raves incoherently and dies with her certificate of merit from her school days next to her. Svidrigailov pulls Raskolnikov aside to say he will provide for Katerina's funeral and for the family after her death. Raskolnikov asks why Svidrigailov is offering his help, and Svidrigailov answers that he has been on the other side of the wall. He hints that he has overheard Raskolnikov's confession and promises that they will learn to get along together in the future. Part 6. Chapter 1. Raskolnikov passes the next several days in a fog. He worries about Svidrigailov and meets with him several times after Katerina's death. Svidrigailov has set money aside to send the children to a good orphanage. Raskolnikov attends Katerina's memorial service with Sonia and realizes that, if he could get away from everyone and be completely alone, he would attain happiness. Razumikin visits him in his apartment to ask whether Raskolnikov is mad, and why he has abandoned his mother and sister. His mother complains that Raskolnikov is hanging about with Sonia, whom she calls that one. Razumikin concludes that Raskolnikov does not seem mad, and that he has simply come to express displeasure at his friend's behavior. Raskolnikov tells Razumikin he has spoken highly of him to his sister, and has said Razumikin will remain her and Pulcheria's providence in the coming days and weeks. Raskolnikov tells Razumikin that his secret will be revealed very soon. Razumikin says that Dunya has received a letter, presumably from Svidrigailov, that she finds very disturbing. He also reports that Nikolai the painter has confessed to the two murders. Razumikin leaves, believing that Raskolnikov has been involved in a political intrigue and is hiding his activities to escape detection. He realizes the letter is probably from Svidrigailov and rushes to intercept Dunya. Raskolnikov worries to himself that even Razumikin has come to suspect that he, Raskolnikov, has committed the murders. He resolves to visit Svidrigailov and finish with him, but as he leaves his apartment he runs into Porfiry. Horrified, Raskolnikov demands that Porfiry speak. Chapter 2. Porfiry begins by talking about his cigarettes and by apologizing to Raskolnikov for the ungentlemanly tone of their last meeting. Porfiry begins, in his characteristically circuitous way, explaining the development of his thoughts regarding Raskolnikov's guilt. First, he says he heard rumors of Raskolnikov's fainting in the police station. Then he saw the article Raskolnikov wrote as a student. Porfiry mentions Raskolnikov's conversation with Zamyatov, which also seemed to lend credence to his boldness and guilt. But all these explanations were only psychological, says Porfiry. He was worried that, without physical proof, he would not be able to find the killer. Porfiry then explains Nikolai's confession, which he set about disproving, especially since Nikolai was revealed to be a religious schismatic, or unorthodox believer, and a young man prone to exaggeration. Finally, Raskolnikov asks who killed the two if not Nikolai. Porfiry responds, matter-of-factly, "Why, you did." Raskolnikov feebly denies Porfiry's charge and blames it all on the investigator's psychological games. Porfiry says that, despite the fact that his evidence is only psychological, he knows Raskolnikov is the killer, and he has come beforehand, in a breach of protocol, to announce that he will have Raskolnikov arrested soon. Porfiry wishes also to say that he is not a monster but a reasonable man, and that it would be to Raskolnikov's advantage to confess to the crime at the station. Porfiry says that Raskolnikov will have his sentence reduced if he confesses. Raskolnikov responds that he doesn't want a reduction at all. Porfiry tells Raskolnikov not to be a coward, but rather to confess and accept his suffering. Porfiry says he will arrest Raskolnikov in a day or two, and that he knows Raskolnikov will not run away in that time, because it is impossible for him to do without his friends and family in Petersburg. Raskolnikov listens and then, seeing he is not under arrest at the moment, gets up to take a walk. Porfiry wishes him a fine time in the meanwhile, and Raskolnikov repeats that he has confessed to nothing, which Porfiry acknowledges as Raskolnikov leaves. Chapter 3. Raskolnikov hurries to Svidrigailov's and worries that the latter has already seen Porfiry. Raskolnikov wonders whether it is worth it at all to further attempt to conceal his guilt. Raskolnikov worries, too, that Svidrigailov will use the information he has against Raskolnikov to blackmail him and gain power of Dunya. He fears that Razumikin, who still knows nothing of his guilt, will not be able to stop Svidrigailov from getting to Dunya. Raskolnikov passes through the Haymarket and sees Svidrigailov seated in a tavern. The latter attempts to leave, but thinks better of it and calls to Raskolnikov to join him. Raskolnikov says that he was going to meet Svidrigailov at his house, but that he typically doesn't go this way through the Haymarket. Their meeting in the tavern is a coincidence. Svidrigailov replies that, though Raskolnikov has been in a daze for the past 48 hours, Svidrigailov actually suggested this as a meeting place. Therefore it is not fate, but actually the product of a previous conversation. Raskolnikov says that if Svidrigailov believes he has power over him, Svidrigailov might be surprised to learn that Raskolnikov cares less for his circumstances than would a normal man. He is growing weary of covering his tracks. Svidrigailov replies that he is simply bored, a depraved man without a profession, and he was hoping Raskolnikov would tell him something new. Svidrigailov has been drinking one glass of wine quite slowly, but it has gone to his head and he becomes inebriated. When Raskolnikov asks in jest whether Svidrigailov would ever consider shooting himself to allay his boredom, Svidrigailov grows nervous. He does not like to hear the topic of death discussed. He decides to tell Raskolnikov the story of the new woman he has met in Petersburg, who has attempted to save and reform him. Chapter 4. Svidrigailov recounts first the story of his marriage to Marfa, who bought him out of debtor's prison, and to whom he confided, at the start of the relationship, that he could not remain totally faithful. They strike a deal in their marriage whereby Svidrigailov is allowed dalliances with servant girls, but no permanent mistress while living on Marfa's estate in the provinces. Svidrigailov says that Marfa often confided in Dunya on the estate, saying Svidrigailov was an immoral man. This aroused in Dunya a sense of pity and made it easier, Svidrigailov says, for him to win her affections. Svidrigailov told Dunya that he wished to become a better man, and it was by this stratagem he managed to court her. He then offered Dunya a good deal of money if she would run away with him to America. Dunya, of course, said no, but Svidrigailov claims he offered the money out of a desire to help Dunya, who was supporting both her mother and Raskolnikov. Svidrigailov details the circumstances of his current engagement. The girl is not even 16, yet her parents see in Svidrigailov a man of property who can pay enough to take care of her. Svidrigailov details the scene in which he was first invited to meet the girl, after a conversation with her family. Svidrigailov offered the girl and her family a large sum of money up front, and the girl has promised total respect for Svidrigailov. Svidrigailov complains of the nightlife in Petersburg, the life he used to enjoy before his marriage to Marfa, and says that he does not wish to see those friends anymore, drunks and layabouts as they are. He accuses Raskolnikov of being a Schiller, or a young romantic, a man of ideals in a world that no longer respects morality and goodness. They vow to part ways, but when they leave, Raskolnikov follows behind Svidrigailov on the street. Chapter 5. Raskolnikov states his certainty that Svidrigailov still has designs on Dunya, which he plans to block. Svidrigailov counters that he could call the police and inform them of Raskolnikov's confession. Svidrigailov says that he has given Sonia money to take Katerina's 3 children to an upper-class orphanage. Svidrigailov goes to his apartment to get money for a night on the town. He gets in a carriage and Raskolnikov no longer follows him. Raskolnikov walks past Dunya in the night, not recognizing her. Dunya has come to meet with Svidrigailov, who has only used his carriage as a decoy to get rid of Raskolnikov. Svidrigailov convinces Dunya to follow him back to his apartment, where he wishes Sonia to corroborate his story about Raskolnikov. Sonia is still not home, but Svidrigailov invites Dunya to his apartment and tells her that he eavesdropped on Raskolnikov from behind the adjoining wall. Dunya questions what Svidrigailov has first said in his letter, that Raskolnikov has committed a terrible crime. Svidrigailov insists, however, that he knows the truth, and that he heard Raskolnikov spill out his soul to Sonia over the course of 2 nights. Dunya has a hard time believing the terrible truth about her brother. She admits, however, that Razumikin has showed the article Raskolnikov wrote about crime, and she has had her suspicions about her brother's sanity. Svidrigailov makes an offer. He will not inform the authorities of Raskolnikov's guilt if Dunya agrees to run away with him to America. Dunya says no and attempts to escape the locked apartment. Svidrigailov says that no one is around to witness their conversation, and that, if necessary, he would use force against Dunya. Dunya is appalled. She takes out a revolver, which was originally Marfa's. She shoots once and grazes Svidrigailov's head, wounding him only slightly. Then the gun misfires and Svidrigailov helps her to fix it. He offers her a 3rd chance to kill him, but she throws the gun down and stands back. Dunya promises, nevertheless, that she will not go away with Svidrigailov, and that she cannot be convinced of it even to save her brother. When Svidrigailov hears this, he gives Dunya the key to let herself out of the apartment. He places his hand against his head and feels the small trickle of blood left by the grazing wound. He places the gun in his pocket and goes outside. Chapter 6. Svidrigailov spends the night on the town, drinking and carousing with women he meets in the taverns. He decides later in the evening to go back to the apartment house and visit Sonia, who was at home. He gives Sonia 3,000 rubles and says that, for Raskolnikov, there are only two options: suicide or confession and exile. Svidrigailov vows that he is going to America and that he must leave Sonia now. Svidrigailov then heads to the house of his fiancée, says he is leaving Petersburg for some time, and gives her 15,000 rubles, care of her parents. They are somewhat confused but take the money happily, and the fiancé wonders what will become of Svidrigailov. Svidrigailov walks aimlessly and ends up taking a room in a rundown inn. He attempts to fall asleep and wonders if Marfa's ghost will visit him in his current depressing surroundings. He finds he cannot sleep and stares out into the rain. Walking through the corridor later, he runs into a small girl who is hidden from her mother in the night, and who is worried she will be beaten. Svidrigailov calms the girl and takes her to his room to sleep, though he curses himself for getting involved. He goes to see how the girl, only 5 years old, is doing and realizes she has grown feverish. Her face distorts and she begins laughing at Svidrigailov. He wakes up from the dream in a sweat. He walks outside in the early morning fog and finds a young man standing as a guard outside a building. Svidrigailov tells the guard he is going to America and pulls out a gun. The guard says that this behavior is not allowed and that it's in the wrong place, but Svidrigailov does not listen and shoots himself in the head. Chapter 7. Raskolnikov pays a visit to his mother, who is now staying with Dunya in a better apartment arranged for by Razumikin. Pulcheria admits that she has been reading Raskolnikov's article, and though she does not understand it, she feels her son will one day be a great man. Raskolnikov tells his mother that he loves her, and that nothing will ever change that. Pulcheria does not understand what is happening but recognizes that Raskolnikov is in a dire situation. She crosses him and blesses him before he leaves, asking if he will come again soon. He promises that he will, and departs. He goes back to his apartment and finds Dunya, who has spent the day waiting for Raskolnikov. Dunya asks if he has confessed his crime to their mother, and he says no. He says he could not kill himself, and Dunya says he will have to suffer for his misdeed. Dunya says that his suffering will wash away some part of the guilt. Raskolnikov says that the act itself wasn't really a crime, since the pawnbroker was a vile woman who deserved to die, but Dunya argues that he killed and therefore must pay the price. Raskolnikov says that he has never been less clear why his actions are a crime, whereas other forms of killing are justified. Yet he tells Dunya that the end is near. He must confess. He wonders aloud how hard labor will make him a better person or atone for the crime, but he has resolved to confess anyway. He takes his leave of Dunya, who loves him. He feels that he is unworthy of that love. Chapter 8. Raskolnikov visits Sonia, who has been waiting for him all day. She worries that a fear of death is all that is keeping him alive. He announces that he has come to her for his cross, which she promised him the last time they met. He states his desire to go and confess to the police alone, though Sonia wants to accompany him. He wonders still if there isn't some way to avoid having to admit to his crime. Sonia asks that he bow down and confess to the murders in a public place. He leaves Sonia, walks through the Haymarket, and gives a 5-kopeck piece to an old woman. He falls down in the street, bowing and standing up again, but he is not able to say aloud that he is killed. The people around him believe he is merely drunk. Raskolnikov walks to the police station and realizes he wishes to confess to Gunpowder, the loud lieutenant and assistant to Nikodem. Raskolnikov enters and sees Gunpowder but cannot confess. He stammers and says instead that he has come to talk to Zemiatov, who is out. He has a brief, trifling conversation with Gunpowder. As they speak, Raskolnikov overhears someone else talking about how Svidrigailov has killed himself. He walks outside, not having the courage to confess and rattled by Svidrigaïlov's death. In the courtyard he finds Sonia, who wordlessly urges him back into the station to admit to his crime. He turns and re-enters the building. He walks up to Gunpowder, who is confused about his return, and announces simply, "It was I who killed the official's widow and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them." Epilogue. Chapter 1. The epilogue opens in Siberia, where Raskolnikov has been sent to a prison camp 1.5 years after the crime. In an official statement after his confession, Raskolnikov gave exact details of the crime and told the authorities the rock under which the stolen articles might be found. Authorities are confused as to why Raskolnikov made no efforts actually to steal the goods. This and Dr. Zosimov's testimony caused them to find that Raskolnikov was temporarily insane during the crime. Raskolnikov's confession of guilt causes him to receive a lighter sentence. It is also revealed that, as a student, he looked after an old man and carried 2 children out of a burning apartment. These stories also granted Raskolnikov some leniency during sentencing, since they attested to his goodness of character. Pulcheria became ill at the start of the proceedings. Pulcheria seems at first to think that her son was taken away because he had powerful enemies, perhaps connected to a political intrigue. But slowly Pulcheria stops talking about Raskolnikov at all, only to say, in later days, that he is a good boy with a bright future ahead of him. Raskolnikov and Sonia left for Siberia together, and Razumikin married Dunya. Razumikin hopes to raise enough money to join his friend in Siberia after several years. Pulcheria approves of their marriage and continues raving about Raskolnikov as she is dying, saying that he would come to her 9 months after their last meeting. But upon Pulcheria's death she reveals, indirectly, to Razumikin and Dunya that she really knows what has become of Raskolnikov, that he is in exile for his terrible crime. Raskolnikov only learns of his mother's death much later. Sonia has maintained a correspondence with Petersburg, and in her letters she details Raskolnikov's captivity and facts alone, without attesting to anything beyond them. She tells of Raskolnikov's living conditions, what he does for work, his appearance. Sonia visits Raskolnikov every so often. She has settled in the town near the camp and has taken on some work as a seamstress, but in her latest letter to Siberia Sonia indicates that Raskolnikov has taken ill and is in the camp's sick ward. Chapter 2. Raskolnikov is in fact ill, perhaps from overwork and the new climate and conditions. He wonders to himself what will become of him when he is released. He will only be 32 at that time, since he was sentenced to 8 years hard labor, but he is not sure he wants to rejoin the outside world. He believes, after much thought, that the true nature of his crime is not that he committed it, but rather that he was too weak not to confess. In prison he lives quietly and mostly keeps to himself. He is taken for godless by some of the fellow prisoners, but they love Sonia, whom they consider a saint, and eventually grow to tolerate Raskolnikov. When he is in the sick room, recovering, he has a dream that a new plague has entered Europe from Asia, and that it causes whole nations to rise up and fight one another, to destroy each other, until a new, pure generation is able to live on earth. Raskolnikov hears that Sonia is sick and worries about her health, but it is only a passing cold. He recovers fully and goes back to work in the camp. One day, he is seated outside, enjoying the view of nature, when Sonia sits next to him suddenly. Raskolnikov has a moment of clarity and falls at Sonia's feet, weeping and acknowledging his love for her. He recognizes the manner in which Sonia loves him, that indeed she lives entirely for him, and this has given him strength to be new risen. In the barracks that night he falls asleep with the newfound assurance that all will be all right, that he will rehabilitate and leave the prison camp a better man. He takes out the New Testament from under his pillow, which was given him by Sonia, and from which he had her read him the story of Lazarus. He thinks that his confinement of 7 years is, in truth, not so long. The narrator reveals that Raskolnikov's rehabilitation will take some time, and that it will in fact be quite difficult. But that is the subject for another novel, and the narrator concludes the present story with this fleeting reference to Sonia and Raskolnikov's future happiness. The moral of crime and punishment is that guilt and crime are inseparable, and redemption is possible through confession, suffering, and love. It emphasizes moral responsibility and the transformative power of compassion. Thank you for staying with us. Your support means the world.